devices alive. Nobody would attack the switch in your network, would they? Never. Nobody would ever attack the Cisco gear. It's beige. I mean, nobody attacks it except the employees of Black Hat who are doing publicity stunts. But I mean, nobody would attack it. Anyway, let's see. Shmoo-balls. Buy some more shmoo-balls. EFF. You were supposed to test fire. You had a quiz at the last intro. You forgot this. You're supposed to be throwing them at me to make sure they work, right? Anyway, are we all set? Yeah. We're all set. You've got both things. All right, here you go.
Hi, folks. Sorry about the minor AV hiccup. I wrote the talk at...
Excuse me. I forgot a step. Because you guys can't figure out... I have some sample suits for you to throw balls at because you're... I mean, come on. Middle row here. Come on. People... Yeah, right. Okay, fine. Another one? Can we have another one? All right, fine. Just a couple more. All right, fine. Okay, they do work. Thank you. Now that we've tested the equipment, you always make sure you test your security equipment right. This is an important point. Okay, thank you very much. All right.
So now y'all are out, right? He brought a... okay, yeah. So I better not say anything wrong. Hi, folks. I'm Raven, and I work with backbone and infrastructure stuff a good bit, usually on the happy side of the force, but I've done a good bit of backbone pen testing. And I got the idea for the talk today after looking at an interesting bug report that came out about a Cisco bug maybe 6 to 8 months ago. And okay, so you can't see the hyperlinks, but I will. They're just references to the stuff I'm talking about. I'll make the slides available so that you can see them a little better. But anyway, so there was a VTP bug that FX came up with about 6 or 8 months ago, and basically what the bug is that if you give it the wrong version number, then your router dies. What? And this is obviously very stupid. And before this point, I hadn't thought much about fuzzing or doing much fuzzing myself. I'm sort of a molasses programmer, and didn't think that I would work on any frameworks like that. But that's certainly something that should have been caught by basic QA. I mean, just like the previous speaker was saying, if you're going to be doing input validation, at least check, is my version number right? If not, maybe reset the connection, not die. And the thing that was particularly bad about it was it killed the whole router, not like the platform. It just dead in the water. So over CCC in Berlin, I was talking to FX about that and said, okay, you released 3 bugs around the same time. How did you find these? Were you fuzzing? And he was like, oh, no, it just messing around, split the field in the packet, boom. And I'm like, okay, so... I mean, FX is clearly a very smart guy. He knows what he's doing. But if you can find that in 10 minutes of, oh, I'm kind of bored before CSI comes on, let me see what I can find, then there's got to be a lot more bad things out there that they're not looking at. And I've talked to people who've done a lot more fuzzing than I have. And they said that, oh, yeah, the vendors, they all fuzz. They're working on this. They're on it. But they're clearly not totally on it. And the other thing that was striking about that bug is that it's not really a version of iOS that's that old. Like 12.1, it's not like it was in like 11.4 or something that we're all long over. There's still plenty of gear running these versions out there. So for anyone who, this may be your first time around a HackerCon or something, if you don't know what fuzzing is, it's just sending random or semi-random data to something that takes input. And people have been doing this publicly for maybe 5 years or so, and privately for much longer than that. And they fuzz any kind of thing that takes input. They do file systems, they do all kinds of hardware validation, and they also do network-based protocols, which is my particular area of interest. So you send it stuff it's not supposed to get, and then you kind of look and go, you dead yet? Anything interesting? Core dump? And you do this again and again, and eventually you find stuff. And for the area of this talk that we're interested in, we're going to be looking at backbone protocols. I've done a lot with infrastructure security, so RIP, BGP, EIGRP, OSPF, and the switching stuff. So why do we care? Well, First of all, you like your ISPs to work. So that whole infrastructure stability thing is a big driver for me. Before I was a security geek, I was an ISP geek, and I spent a lot of time worrying about the sorts of scenarios that you only really see in bad B movies late at night. But also, in the sort of gaining knowledge territory, because a lot of the platforms that do this infrastructure stuff are not very open, by fuzzing them and seeing the failure conditions, you can gain some insight into little-known areas of how they work, what they do when they fail, and you get some free QA. You know, I haven't been at this terribly long, but I've already turned up a couple of interesting pieces, and I think that there are far more out there waiting to be found. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to describe my methodology, and anyone else who wants to chip in and do this also, please have at it. Send me email. It's really awesome. I'm biased. All right. So what have people done before I started looking at it? Well, BGP is obviously the big heavy hitter on the internet backbone, and so that's where most of the research so far for this has come from. And there was a talk in 2003 by a couple of guys that work for Cisco, and they were interested in investigating BGP threats on the internet. And there'd been a lot of discussion in Nanog and other service provider communities before this about, well, what about this? We could do this. And, well, what if there was an evil router? Well, what if there was an evil router peering at a public peering point, and they injected all kinds of crap into the switch? And, so the papers set out to separate the real threat conditions from the problems, and among the things that they studied were fuzzing. Now, I looked into their methodology, and being ISP folks, they didn't really release, hey, here's exactly what my code is, and here's totally how I did it, and here's the problems I found. When they described bugs, they summarized, they didn't give details and said, and this iOS version from Cisco did such and so, and Juniper did this and that, and Foundry, they died here. They obfuscated it all, and they didn't really release details. They had a little note in their presentation that said, hey, if you want to know what's going on, send us email. If we think you need to know, then you get to know. So we can't really determine what it was they fuzzed. They talked about, like I did, they looked at ISIC as an early step for a framework, but it didn't get deep enough into the packet for them, so they just wrote their own protocol-independent fuzzer. And for the most part, their work was pretty good. They had trials of all kinds of different things. They looked at very different layers of BGP. They attacked the underlying TCP layer and tried to mess that up. They attacked BGP itself. They looked at the authentication. What if you're unauthenticated? What if you're a trusted peer? Where can I break? So that was all very good and solid. But they're not completely thorough. This was the same talk where they said that nobody could successfully attack the underlying TCP layer, and Paul Tony Watson was watching this and said, oh, that's crap, and then he went out and wrote the TCP windowing thing that made such a big splash at CanSec that year. So, clearly these guys were not right about everything, but there was at least some decent early research. So other than that, people have not really made a big deal thus far about what they found with looking at the backbone protocols. RIP, if you use Scapy, which is a Python framework for packet manipulation, and you can also fuzz with it to some degree, but you have to know Python, and you have to be willing to write a lot of the framework stuff yourself. There is a little hook for the header and the entry for RIP, but RIP is the very slow, old, teeny internal network routing protocol, and so it's one of the ones of least interest, and it only works for RIP v1, which is, if you still have that running in your network, I'm very sorry for you. OSPF, there's open source software that will allow you to speak OSPF, and of course, most gear will talk it. It's not owned by anyone. It's an open standard, and so you see a lot of implementations of it, not just in routers and switches, but also in firewalls and a lot of VPN software. They're now including routing functionality in it, and these are all good devices to test. EIGRP is Cisco's baby, and so there is a Perl script that a bunch of Russian dudes wrote that will allow you to speak EIGRP, kind of like Zebra will let you speak OSPF and BGP. But it's a little painful to use. It's still in a very early stage of development, and so the script is out there, but there's nothing to do fuzzing specifically. My biggest problem, yes? So it's a packet crafter specifically for OSPF that they built and released? Oh, that's awesome. I hadn't heard about that. Please come up afterwards and tell me all about it. The comment was that 2 weeks ago in Prague, there was a tool released that does OSPF packet crafting, which, fantastic. So the biggest problem that I had when doing this is that the gear that does this that you really want to test is not something that is easy for, independent security researcher person to afford. I try and keep my corporate hat and my researcher hat separate so that I don't get my employer sued. And so I don't want to take stuff from my job and start, messing around with that because I don't want to give them ownership of my work. This sadly means that my budget for testing this stuff is my personal budget and not like, my corporate budget. And because a lot of it is purpose-built specialty hardware with proprietary operating systems, I think one of the reasons that this has not been deeply explored is because just getting your hands on the gear is a problem. So if anyone has any, or if you work for someone that has some and is willing to let me have it free to mess around with, I'll return it intact and happy. But the catch is that you don't get ownership of my results, which is why I don't have any yet. So what I did the testing with was mostly on the open source routing engines running on some flavor of Unix. I tried it on Gen 2 on BSD and on Mac OS X. A couple of weeks before the conference, I finally got my hands on a Cisco 2600. So I've been doing some work against 2 different versions of iOS, but I don't have anywhere near robust results on that because, hey, 2 weeks. So thank you to the person who got me the router. You're my favorite. If anyone has Juniper F5 gear, you can be my new favorite. Yes?
You mentioned that you were primarily looking at the routing protocol. Can you spend any time looking at the signaling protocols? You mentioned that MPLS at one point, but also what about the ISDN signaling, the baseband signaling?
You're so 2 slides ahead of me. The question was, I looked at routing protocols, what about signaling and switching type stuff? And we'll get there. So the other thing that has been complicated with this is that I've been on travel for my job for most of the last 2 weeks, and so I've been hauling around a router in my luggage and hacking in airports and hotels. I actually got yelled at BWI. I got in 5 hours before the person I was meeting, and so I pulled out the router and my 2 laptops and hooked everything together and sat by a power strip by a baggage claim hacking on the router. And the security people came by and said, "Ma'am, no making people nervous. You need to put that away." They took my power cord, and they made me pack up the router. So, just bear that in mind for the kind of results you're getting. This is what someone hacking in an airport can do. I'm sure it can be done better by people who have budgets and labs and companies and things like that. And what I really want to have happen out of this is I want the vendors to incorporate this into their QA routines. Because, rumor has it that various vendors are and should be, but if we can get VTP bugs like that happening, they're not doing it very well. That's a very basic thing to find. So any vendors that are not doing it because you don't know how, I will give you my slides. I will come and spend time with you for free and explain what it is I'm doing and why you should fix it. If you don't care, there's not much I can do about that except shake my little angry fist. So what I'd really like to see is this incorporated into QA. All right. So when you're testing, how do you know what's worthwhile to find? How do you know that you're actually getting results? How do you know you're getting good results? Well, 2 of the things I used to benchmark were, okay, we have a number of known vulnerabilities out there. When I'm trying fuzzing against it, do I find the things we know are wrong? And then secondly, do we find new and interesting broken things that we hadn't heard about before? And because you can't just hook a debugger into Cisco iOS or a lot of these other proprietary platforms, unless you're Mike, it's a lot harder to tell when you hit a failure condition. You don't see always blatant, hey, I screwed up in memory allocation. Oh my God, you overran my buffer. A lot of the time, you have to sort of deduce failure, and there's a number of different mechanisms that I use for that. So when you find an old bug and you can trigger it and you can see what the router does, what you get in your logs, what you get as far as like hanging or timing differences or things like that, that will let you know what you're looking for when you find a new one. I did find new bugs that were sufficiently different from the old known ones that when you test one of these old ones, don't imprint like a duckling and go, that's it. If I do not see CPU hog in my router logs, it's crap. You know, there's obviously going to be more things out there that are worth looking at. All right, so looking at Zebra and Quagga. They don't have a lot that gets press about what's wrong with them because pretty much the only people that really use it are people that are doing backbone stuff like me and networking people. And networking people are not looking for bugs. They find them accidentally and cuss a lot, but you know, they're not like, I wonder if this is exploitable. That doesn't tend to happen. So if you look up on OSVDB or a lot of the other public places, you find like maybe 5 or 6 bugs in this software. If you go through their change logs, you can find several more, but you know, there's not a lot out there so far. And the other thing is that some of the kinds of bugs you find are ones that are not subtle. They're not like, are more subtle than you'd find like during your basic fuzz testing. So if you're just doing throw everything in the kitchen sink at it fuzzing and the available vulnerability is a route injection or something, you might not notice. You're only going to see the denial of services if you're looking on that sort of superficial level. And so one of the known bugs is a RIP route injection. Basically, if it's asking for authentication and you send it RIP and you don't send it the right kind of authentication and you mess around with the version number, you can inject a route that's not supposed to be in the routing table without having authentication. And they fixed that. But when you're doing it, if I were just fuzzing, I would not have seen this if I didn't know it was there. Like when you know where it is and you say, okay, so I'm going to fuzz from this point in the packet, I'm going to inject data after this offset and see what happens, then you can trigger, okay, I tried to dump a route of, you know, %5 QT4 or whatever, and that didn't work. But unless you're looking for it, you won't see it. So this is sort of an emphasis that fuzzing can fix interesting things and it can find many bugs, but it's not a substitute for exhaustive research or looking at everything. So, going through with Zebra and Quagga, I found 7 things that weren't there before, and that's not too bad. I'm still working through the reporting process. 3 of them look like they're things that were referenced in the change logs and were fixed, but not completely. 4 of them look brand new. So I think that, you know, in addition to finding some of the old bugs and a bunch of new things, this does sort of prove out the methodology to some degree and say, okay, you know, this works to some degree. So when you're doing protocol analysis for a new protocol, in most of the backbone protocols, there are not existing fuzzers for. So if you want a custom-built protocol fuzzer, you're going to have to write one or use somebody's framework. And we'll get to how I did it in a little bit, but I used somebody's framework after a dismal attempt at writing some. So what I found to be the most useful is when you pick your target protocol, read the books, read the RFCs, figure out how it's supposed to work, and then spend some time with Wireshark and figure out what it actually does, which is usually very different from what it should do. And particularly all the vendors that you're going to test, it's worthwhile looking at their implementations because you will see fingerprint style differences in the implementations between vendors. And they're, you know, compliant enough to talk to each other most of the time, but they may set random values to different things or empty fields or unallocated fields to different things regardless of what the RFC says. And so by getting a good idea of what's going on, you can get a good idea of what you're going to do after that. So PCAP, PCAP, PCAP. I have tons and tons of packet capture files of various sorts, and it's interesting that a lot of the parameters that are not really important in the functioning of the protocol can be things that will screw it up if you mess with it in a fuzzer. So it's worthwhile to look at the whole thing, not just, okay, where's the source, where's the destination, where's the authentication go? So when I started this, I thought, okay, you know, I'm going to write like 10 fuzzers in 3 months, and it'll be awesome, and no one has ever done anything like this before. And I quickly realized that, you know, this is not such a good idea, particularly when you code with the speed of blazing molasses like I do. And seriously, my grandmother is a better programmer than I am, and she's much faster. She's 95. I do have a couple of people who volunteered to sling code in parallel with me or instead of if I felt like it, and I'm going to draft them at future points, but in order to just get the basics done, to test like, you know, the 5 major routing protocols and, you know, mess with what I could of the switching stuff. I figured it was better to go with a framework, and then we'll fill in with custom code what the framework isn't able to handle. So I looked around, and the applied security guys out there are going to make me nervous when if they're sitting in the audience, because I used their tool. It was pretty useful. I was pleased with it. I saw Jared's presentation at TorCon and had dinner with him and talked about fuzzing, and it seemed to be the best fit of the existing fuzzing frameworks for what I wanted to do. It doesn't have pre-built definitions for all of my various protocols, but it speaks TCP and UDP, and that's really all you need. You just have to have an idea of what you're looking for. I looked at ISIC, but like the Cisco guys, it didn't go deep enough into the packet for me, and it was great for, like, the first X many bytes, and then it just sort of tapered off. I looked at Protos also, but that just was a lot more work heavy than doing it with GPF. And so partly for ease of implementation, partially for feature robustness, I ended up working with GPF. I also had several friends who work for companies that write fuzzing stuff very kindly offer to give me their stuff, but I wanted to keep it open so I could, just say, hey, here's what I got. So why I like GPF and how it was useful in this project. It can take PCAP files as an input. You want to filter out everything except the conversation for the protocol that you're analyzing. And then it can spit that traffic back out and modify bits of it individually with various levels of intelligence. But the feature that I really enjoyed is that it can take the PCAP and put it out in a text-like format. You can change the username or the password or whatever parameter you want, the version number, just in a text file, dump it back in, and it will spit that out. And you can get very, very fine control if you don't want to just run the fuzz everything. And so that allows you to do kind of like what FX did with the version bug, but much more quickly. Okay, I know these 4 things are likely to be screwed up, test, 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 test. And because it has such a wide variety of intelligence modes, you can go from, I don't even speak this protocol, binary crap, to, okay, flip these 2 bits and then jump 4, and I want a little offset there, and space it out, 18 seconds between each attempt, because otherwise the router dies. And that's a big range of flex, and I found it very useful. What it doesn't do, and this will answer Toby's question from earlier about the switching protocols. It does TCP or UDP. So it covers almost all of my routing protocols, but it's not so handy with the switches. It doesn't even do raw IP. And it's a great tool otherwise, guys. But it means that if I want to do MPLS or if I want to do a lot of the layer 2 stuff, then I'm going to have to write custom fuzzers. And so I'm totally going to take up my volunteers later and make them code for that, because I really want to fuzz MPLS very badly. So there's, as far as I know, no automatic tools that handle the layer 2 stuff that you're going to see on the backbone, except maybe gigabit Ethernet. But most links, just people are not focused on that, or if they are, they work for some vendor and they're in some lab that I'm not allowed to hear about. The other thing that GPF does not do is you can run it for a while. You can send lots and lots of data to your target, but it's not going to be very efficient at exhaustively searching every bit, every feature of every packet. And honestly, that's not my job. That's something that the vendors should do when they're doing their own QA, but the time investment for that is huge and ridiculous, and just no. So the different modes that I used it for the project. There's sort of the dumb mode of pure fuzz, which will just throw everything at it possible, binary, kitchen sink, Elvis, whatever, and it will just, see what kicks back out. The mode I used the most was their main mode, and that's the one that allows you all of those little, okay, go this far and then inject fuzzing data. All right, take this little bit here and tweak it. There is a lot of fairly heavy specialized command line foo. It's a tool with a fairly steep learning curve, but their README file that doubles as their man page is pretty exhaustive. So if you just keep that up in a giant terminal window, you can figure it out, and they give you lots of examples, and it's pretty helpful. But it allows great specificity in jumping around to the portions of the packet that you're really interested in. And most of the time for this project was spent in main mode going, well, what if I flip this bit here? The downside to this when you're doing it is that in order to know where you ought to flip the bits, it requires a deeper knowledge of the protocol. So you're going to either have to spend some time hitting the books and with your PCAP, or having worked with the protocol in the wild to know what might be useful. You know, it's entirely possible that you may just throw stuff at it and luck out, but I think that you're more likely to find interesting things if you have an understanding of what it is you're breaking first. The convert mode is the one I mentioned before. That's the really handy take PCAP, give text, modify text, put back out. That one was great, particularly for like little teeny 2-byte fields and things like that. Just, okay, I'm going to go through here, give it these 5 values, what's it do, is it interesting? You can also do that with the main mode command line stuff, but if you're just checking a couple of things, this may be faster. They also have a mode that they really recommend using called pattern fuzz. I didn't find this as directly useful for the backbone purposes, because what they're intending it for is areas where you get like ASCII text input, like session keys or authentication tokens or things like that. And while there are authentication tokens in some of the backbone protocols, if you turn them on, like OSPF has some, BGP has some, a lot of the time the best I got out of the pattern fuzzing was timing screw-ups, and I'm not sure whether that was the protocol or whether that was the implementation. So like if you feed it a bad authentication key and it just says no screw you, bad authentication key, no screw you, bad authentication key, no screw you. And so, the crypto folk might be all over that or something. There's something causing that timing holdup, but since at that point I was working on the Cisco and that's not open source, it's hard to know what that is without a lot more work. So hopefully we'll get there. I found that it was useful for the session and authentication data when used in this mode, but most of the time I was using the main mode instead. All right, so when you have something bad happen, how it's useful to know. If you get a core dump, you have obviously caused a problem. Pat yourself on the back, be proud. There are also things that will show up in the debug logs, but not always. I would recommend whatever device you're working on, go through and turn on the max debug before you start. That's just common sense. With Cisco's, you will often get complaints about a watchdog timeout if the watchdog process is not able to contact the process that you've hung or killed, or CPU hog if it's a resource consumption kind of DOS and you just spike it up. But other times, you'll just get like the silent DOS. Okay, I was speaking this, now I'm not. And what I found useful for those is, GPF gives you a little offset so that you can feed it a seed so that you can replicate the exact fuzzing traffic, so you don't have to like PCAP everything and go through the PCAP with like a fine-tooth comb trying to figure out what you did and why it caused something. So you can replicate and say, okay, I did this, it died, I'm going to do exactly that again with the same random crap. And that's very useful. But when you get the silent process death or the silent listener stopping, the thing I found useful was to run it again, but chop a packet off the end. Okay, did it still die? No? Run it again, chop a packet off the end. And you can eventually sort of network debug step back to the packet that killed it and find out where your insertion point is for where things go wrong. Another thing that is useful to keep an eye on is odd network traffic. So if it's a TCP protocol and you start getting resets and you hadn't had that when you were running under normal operation, that might be a sign that it's at least recognizing that you're doing something funny. Long lags and timing are also useful for this. And then your basic system maintenance stuff. So if you have some sort of network monitoring system that is watching memory usage on your routers, that's watching processors, you can learn a lot by seeing, assuming these are lab systems and you don't have other load that's skewing your results, because that can really mess you up. Just saying, okay, so where did I see a big jump in memory allocation? Okay, what was I doing at that time? And syncing them time-wise, while I wasn't able to do that in the airport so well, is good if you have an actual lab. If you're working on a Cisco device, the output of show tech can give you a lot of helpful stuff. If you're working on other platforms, there are usually send this big pile of stuff to tech support and help me out. All right, so assuming you've done all this, you find a bug, you win. Now what? Well, if you're on Zebra or Quagga, you've got open source. You can track back and say, okay, where in the code is it doing this? Can I find what's actually going on? Was there a question in the back?
Typical responses for Quagga and some typical responses for Cisco. Did you correlate any of them, or is they probably?
No, they're very different. The responses for Quagga and Cisco, sometimes a similar style of thing would cause them both, like, okay, if I'm messing with OSPF authentication fields, sometimes I can see like disturbances in the force on both sides, but you're not going to see the exact same manifestation of, oh, I see, they've both parsed the authentication packet in this exact way, and they have the same flaw in the code. It also helps that they're running on different architectures. All the stuff, except for on the PowerPC chip, all the stuff I was doing for Quagga and Zebra, the other systems were x86, and your Cisco processors are not going to be, and so that's going to affect your manifestation as well. So if you're working on the open source platforms, which are very helpful to learn this kind of thing, but honestly, they're not where the big bang interest is. If you go up and say, hey, Raven found a really bad flaw in Zebra, like, 5 people care. You really need to find it in what's being used in the wild for people to find it really hot stuff. Yes?
2 thoughts. One, I'm curious, you said that there were fairly wide variations between types of responses. I really would wonder, though, with the lower level protocols, if you wouldn't find that they're all basically re-implementing the same parser that they got as the reference implementation from the standards body.
Yeah, the question was on the lower level stuff that he wouldn't be surprised if there was more similarity the further down you got, because they were all basing it off, similar references or similar things they got from the standards body. And we've seen things like that, like when there was the problem in BSD-derived telnet implementations. It wasn't just the Unix guys that had to patch. A lot of network equipment vendors all ran around and they all had to release and patch too. So there is certainly the problem of code inheritance and bugs being propagated across systems based on where they got it. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised either in some of these cases. But so, okay, when you do find a bug on Cisco or one of the other major vendors, then what? And after the whole Cisco Gate thing, the Cisco CSO guy was very nice to me and apologized for them being such jerks and tearing pages out of books and stuff like that, and said, oh, if there's anything I can do to help you in the future while you're working on our stuff, please let me know. And I was like, oh, I saw this bug and I want to fuzz stuff and I think it's really bad, so if you can send me a couple of routers, I'll send you what I get and give you 30 days responsible disclosure time. I have not gotten any routers. So I think that's kind of indicative. He was very polite, but I don't think they're very interested in independent researchers breaking their stuff. And there's the culture gap between very conservative, you don't need to know that soldier ISP folks, and the woohoo, I got your source code people in this room. There is a little more similarity than you'd think. The 2003 paper that the Cisco engineers wrote, they actually said at one point, we need independent researchers to verify this, we need people to extend this work, we want to see people working on that. So there are at least some people on the other side of the fence that are interested in collaboration and in propagating this kind of work. But if you do find a bug in Cisco and you're not Mike Lynn, you may have a hard time tracing it back and finding out exactly what caused it, and not to mention all their internal watchdog and checker processes. So, if anyone finds things, I will be interested to hear about it. I'd be more than happy to tap their CSO guy and say, hey, what about this? He may or may not respond, but we'll see how he handles mine. So, basically, more people should be working on this because it's awesome. My to-do list for this project, now that I've gotten to at least have a basic look at the routing protocols. Since I haven't had the 2600 very long, I want to spend a lot more time with it. I want to fuzz with more than 2 versions of iOS. I have basically a version that was hot stuff in 1997, and I have the latest version, and it would be kind of nice to see the development of where things get fixed in between, as well as what I can find on the latest versions. It's going to get really interesting when they move to their loadable kernel module kind of architecture sometime in the next couple of years. That's going to really change how they implement. I want to write fuzzers for the layer 2 stuff. You know, if there are no automated tools that can handle that sort of thing, then we're just going to have to write them. Fortunately, I have 2 very skilled programmer volunteers who are happy to help me write it. Right, guys? But I really want to do MPLS, particularly because of its role in traffic engineering and choosing path direction. I think that that's a very important protocol to be able to be assured of. And I want to give my CodeMonkey collaborator people more stuff to do. Yes?
There's already something for MPLS published from a British guy, which is pretty unknown, but it's publicly available. I'll get to you.
Great, fantastic. The comment was that there is some stuff on MPLS done by a British guy. Clearly I need to spend more time in Europe because that's where they're doing the cool stuff these days. Thank you guys for listening, and if you guys have any layer 2 fuzzing code, free gear, $1 million in a pony, or anything else you want to give me, this is my email address. I would be pleased to hear from you, and anyone who wants the slides can also drop me a line. I'm going to give them to the conference folk, and I'm sure you can get them through them, but you know, I will also give them to you directly. Do we have any questions? Yes?
During your working with the PCAPs, with the Wireshark or any other type of automated protocol analysis tools, thanks. During your analysis where you're looking at PCAPs and you're looking at the automated, anything like, you know, Wireshark does the protocol analysis, did you actually, with some of the stuff where you'd varied things, actually break some of your analysis tools?
No, I didn't, but with Wireshark, I would not be terribly surprised since they have had that happen.
Yeah,
I was kind of wondering, I checked, like when I spit out the output, I checked it in both Wireshark and in TCP dump a couple of times just to make sure that it was looking the same in both tools and I wasn't having interference with my analysis tools, but I never found like a serious break. Yes?
So kind of a naive question because I know nothing about backbone routing. But let's imagine you did find a vulnerability in BGP or something. Mm-hmm. Could I then set up my PC at home and inject a packet into the internet and bring down the routers from the WAN side?
It would depend on what the vulnerability was. So with BGP, when you're actually talking up on the BGP layer, not the TCP layer that supports it, you have to have a configured neighbor, or you're supposed to have a configured neighbor. And if you aren't that configured neighbor, then you won't be able to talk. So what the routers should do is if they get a BGP packet from someone who is not in their config as a neighbor, they should just drop it. Most of them do. The 2003 study found that a couple of them didn't. Some of them responded and actually did the handshaking and set it up. But it depends on where the bug is. If the bug is, you know, somewhere in the TCP setup of the BGP session, then that occurs before you get to the point of, oh, is this neighbor someone I know? And so that would affect it from anywhere. But for the most part, the things that have been found in BGP so far, you would have to successfully spoof a trusted authentication partner. Yes?
Thanks. Did you ever figure out how your laptop got hacked at last ShmooCon?
I have, I've done a bunch of forensic stuff with some Mac OS X people, but I don't have a smoking gun. The reason that I haven't talked publicly about it is because, you know, who wants to be like, oh yeah, some zero-day happened. Someone else was using the laptop and I wasn't running packet captures. It was bad.
How can you protect, like, infrastructure if you can't protect your own laptop?
It was patched to latest. I doubt anyone would do any better.
I'm just curious. Thank you.
Zero-day can happen to anyone.
Hi.
Yes.
Have you talked about iterate chomp?
Mm-hmm.
Have you, I personally haven't tried this yet, but did you see the Matasano guys wrote a protocol debugger?
Yes, yes. They have some really hot stuff.
Did you try that?
It's still in relatively early stages, and so I had to put in some work to get it to compile on my box. I finally got it to work, but it was just more effort than I was willing to put in at that point. It's still sort of early code, and I know they're intending to clean it up and port it to more architectures and make it a little less painful to run, but I did not find it very fast to work with, and since I only got the real gear 2 weeks before the talk, I figured it would be better to go with something that was a little swifter.
Cool. There's also something called Protocol Construction Set that George Neville Nell wrote. He's a FreeBSD developer. So that might be something to look at too. I haven't tried that either, but.
Cool. Yes.
Would you like us to educate him as to how confident you are at backbone protection and why you worry about it?
Dude, I appreciate the thought, but I have no need to enter a dick waving contest. Yes.
It seems like this is kind of a new area. Are there any wikis, forums, mailing lists out there for fuzzing yet, or is this all kind of...
I know there is a fuzzing mailing list, but I am not on it. This is something that I'm interested in for the sake of how it pertains to the backbone. I'm not like, uber programmer of fuzzing everything. I don't know if there are... I don't think there are any backbone-specific fuzzing forums. As far as I know, most of the research is being done by people inside large vendor companies, me, FX, and like 4 other guys.
Okay.
So if we accumulate enough critical mass to merit a mailing list, maybe. But right now, there isn't one.
Yeah, hi. Just a question on coverage. What do you use as criteria to determine sort of when you're sort of finished fuzzing an area? I guess you can't go for fully exhaustive because even automated, that's going to take forever. So when do you decide to move on? And also, how do you choose what your fuzzing depth is going to be in the protocol itself? For a lot of the protocols, I gave them all X number of hours of time. I spent at least 4 hours just throwing random crap at them. But as far as like getting inside the protocol, it was basically to the depth of my knowledge. So things that I have seen fail in the past, things that I think might be problematic, I would target those areas specifically, and how many of them are going to vary depending on what the protocol is. Some have like 4 fields that anyone would care about, and a bunch of blank ones. I did try and spend time with each of the protocols that I worked with, sending just fuzzed crap to the blank fields or fields that were supposed to be initialized to a given variable, because that's a really common area of failure. But a lot of the more detailed stuff is just sort of fuzzy and based on, no pun intended, and based on experience of, okay, I've worked with this one is yay hard, this one is yay hard. I also sort of allotted time based on my feeling of the importance of the protocol. A bug in RIP is not as bad as a bug in BGP. A bug in MPLS, if we ever get it, is so much worse. Yes?
I just want to say I thoroughly enjoyed the talk, and I also want to say that anybody that has the gall to challenge the technical competence of speakers should definitely submit their papers and get on the other side of the podium next year.
Thank you. Is that it? All right. Thanks, guys, for listening.